I bought this Le Mans 3 back in 2017 with the idea of converting it into a cafe racer, which were quite popular back at that time. Over the subsequent 3 years I did a lot of work, including a complete rebuild of the engine and gearbox, making a fiberglass seat pan, making some custom yokes and handlebars, modifying the frame, repainting the bodywork, and I even started on making a new stainless exhaust. But then I lost interest, pushed the bike into a corner of my shed and forgot all about it. After it getting in the way too many times, I decided that I needed to do something with it, be it finish off what I started or return it to its original glory. So with some strong influence from a good friend who has a garage full of Benellis, I decided on the latter and will now restore it back to original, or at least close to original. Luckily the bike was not too short of complete when I bought it. Like many bikes its age, the airbox was long since gone, as was the centre stand. There are some other annoying bits missing that will be difficult to source, such as the black grid from the left hand side panel, and I think the exhaust header should be chromed, not painted black. My modifications to the frame are limited. I had added an additional cross brace under the seat, cut off the rear sections of the frame rails and removed the original seat latch brackets. First of these was easily dealt with the hacksaw, and as I had not thrown away the sections of frame rail, it was an easy job to turn up a couple of slugs to position inside the tubing and weld them back into place. Using the old seat latch brackets, I fashioned some new ones from 3mm mild steel sheet and welded them onto the frame. Whilst I had them MIG to hand, I also filled in a gouge on the frame rail from the bottom of the tank. Some work with the grinder, files and emery cloth, and it's all looking good. With the frame integrity restored, it was off to a local company with a bundle of other parts for blasting and powder coat. The Le Mans has what is referred to as a Tonti frame, which has two lower frame rails which cradle the engine and are bolted to the main frame. This makes assembly relatively simple, as the frame is effectively bolted to the engine rather than the other way around. Before reassembly, I do a trial fit of each lower rail front and back. At the front there is a single bespoke bolt to secure the lower frame rail to the frame, as well as a longer bolt that goes across the frame and through the front engine mount. Here I'm just checking the former. At the rear there are two bolts on each rail which also secure the foot peg brackets, although mine are not original. There are also two hollow pins that the bolts pass through, but given their diameter, 12.6mm or thereabouts, I'm not sure whether these are original items or not. I did run a 12.6mm drill through the frame holes, which does give quite a snug fit. And similar to the front, there is another bolt that goes across the frame and through the rear engine mount. Before fitting the engine, I flushed out the section of frame that is used for the oil vents from the engine and the gearbox. These have a reputation for going rusty on the inside, and in my case I've no doubt that there's a fair bit of blast media in there too. As well as flushing this section out, I also filled it with evaporust and left it for 24 hours, then added some rust treatment. Fingers crossed that will prevent any further rusting. To fit the frame I enlist a friend to help, mainly to avoid damaging the paintwork. Unfortunately I've not videoed this, but first the lower frame rails are loosely bolted through the rear engine mount, and then the frame manoeuvred into place using the front engine bolt as a hinge, so that the frame is then rotated and lowered onto the rear frame rail mounts and then bolted in place. And thank you to Richard on the right here for his help. In the main, the company that did the blasting and powder coat was good at masking off the threaded parts, but did coat over some of the bearing surfaces that would not be obvious to someone who is not familiar with Guzzis. The swing arm bearings being a good example. I was surprised however that Paint Stripper was able to remove the powder coat. Mind you, this Sin Strip is more akin to the olden Nitromores rather than the ineffective stuff that is now sold across the counter here in the UK. Gloves are definitely advised. With the surfaces cleaned, fitting the pivot bearings on either side was a simple job. I thoroughly packed the roller with grease before fitting the dust seal and the bush for the pivot pin. The drive shaft universal joint bearing is a bit trickier given its position deep inside. For this I had left the bearing in the freezer overnight, but I still needed a brass drift to drive it home. I am doing this very carefully, not hitting too hard and working around the circumference of the bearing. Once home I fit the retaining circlip. The drive shaft universal joint now needs to be fitted to the bearing. It is a tight fit and I can't say that I'm overly keen on driving it home via the drive end of the joint. Again, I am being very careful with frequent checks at the other end, and it does take quite a bit of time to get it seated. Before fitting the swing arm to the frame, I do chase out the M20 by 1mm threads for the pivot pins. This is a view of one of the pins in situ. I fit a new boot for the universal joint and clamp it onto the gearbox with a Jubilee clip. After adding a dab of grease to the gearbox output shaft, I offer up the swing arm, align the universal joint to the output shaft and push it home, allowing this end of the boot to pop into place. Then with a bit of jiggling to align the swing arm pivot bushes to the pivot pins, I screw each into place. To finish, I secure the rear of the boot to the swing arm with another Jubilee clip. I did of course slip this into position earlier. After again adding a little grease to the splines, I fit the drive shaft to the output side of the universal joint inside the swing arm and then offer up and secure the hub into position. I'm fitting the rear suspension units for support, but these will be coming off again to be refurbished. I refit the VIN plate using some small rivet pins. To install the yokes, I fit the dust seal and spacer before slipping on and then driving home the bottom bearing. I use a socket to drive over the top part, after which the stem reduces slightly in diameter to just above the seat, and I use an old box wrench to drive it home. I then fit the bearing cups top and bottom to the headstock. I use an old bearing cup to drive the new ones home. With the bottom bearing given an extra dosing of grease, I push the stem up through the headstock and use a piece of timber to hold it in place and then fit the top bearing. With the bearing seated, I fit the top dust cover and nip up the stem nut. I then fit the top yoke with its nut and washer and the clamping bolt, but leave them loose for now. This allows me to slip each fork leg into place and nip up all of the clamping bolts and the top nut. With the basic frame now coming together, I'll wrap up this video. In the next, I'll get the wheels back in place, fit the handlebars and headlight clamps, and start building up the frame internals. If you like the video, please do subscribe and give me a thumbs up. Thanks for watching.